Hello, it's Tim Curtis again. Welcome back to the intensive engagement training course on locally identified solutions and practices. So in the first presentation, I gave some background on the genesis and the ethos of LISP, particularly its identity based in thinking of the neighborhood as being a mess of complex problems, and the role of the police officer in encouraging and supporting the neighborhood and the residents in the neighborhood to develop solutions and practices of their own, which distinguishes neighborhood policing from policing a neighborhood. So policing a neighbourhood could be considered to be the reactive work, blue light work in a particular neighbourhood, as opposed to neighbourhood policing, which is a very different genre, a very different approach. In the LISP process, we have developed out of a whole variety of different approaches to community work, community engagement, problem solving, social innovation, behavior change, a really wide variety of different skill sets that are needed. We've brought them together into a repeatable and consistently repeatable package of activities. So it doesn't matter where you do this, but the important thing is that you go through the same steps for each location, and they will help you design or develop or decide on what package of interventions that you need to use in a particular neighborhood, which might be completely different from the neighborhood next door. So I'm going to work through these 8 steps very briefly, explaining what they entail, and then we'll look in at step 1 a little bit more closely. So the first thing is to actually clarify the justification for starting an intensive engagement LISP project. LISP is intensive. It costs resource and time and effort and resilience and grit. So we need to make sure that we're doing it in the right places, and we want to make sure that we have a clear rationale for investing police resources into an intensive engagement with the community, rather than the broadcast engagement with the community that I described in the last class. So we need to scan what we already know about the neighbourhood that we might be working in. What does the crime and other data tell us? What other issues, what other databases that we have available? How is this particular location different, more problematic, more worthy of our concern than any other district that we might choose to work intensively engage in? In other words, what's the evidence based for adopting this as a particular place to start? The next step is to look at, in LISP step 2, is to consider the assets that already exist in the location, not just assets in terms of money or buildings, but who and what skills can we access? What networks and associations are already there? We need to think about what's vulnerable about the area, but also what makes a place already mostly successful. So this is an idea, an ethos that comes from asset-based community development, making sure that we think about this particular district, even though it's a problem for us. We make sure that we think about this district as being mostly successful most of the time, and if we can access the best of that location, we can enhance and improve the best and reduce the worst parts of it. So having established what is already there and what's already going on, what's already good, we move on to step 3, and trying to identify who else in this particular neighbourhood shares our problem, who else is suffering from or considering that the issues that we have are similar to theirs. And that's about identifying our stakeholders, but it was not just any old stakeholders, but how they associate. So what we're looking for in this particular instance are people who are highly connected and highly capable, who are able to help us. This goes beyond the usual suspects, and making sure we ask smart questions about the people who turn up to our community meetings. Who are these people? How are they connected? How are they representative of all the people in this particular neighbourhood, and are these individuals actually connected together, and do they do stuff? Do they can they help us achieve change? That can be individuals, agencies, community groups, businesses, but ultimately all these agencies that we work with in partnership boil down to individuals. So we're asking questions, quite hard questions sometimes, about who we're working with. Are they highly capable and highly connected? Once we've established the self-interest, we need to understand why they are involved and whether their self-interest fits with our self-interest. We need to understand why they'll be motivated to work with us and collaborate with us. And we need to be quite clear about what their motivation is and what they get out of collaborating with us. When we've done that, we can then start thinking about the problem. So before we start thinking in detail about the problem, we need to make sure we have people in place first. Then we establish a rich picture of the problem. Rich picturing is a specific technique from soft systems methodology and is particularly powerful for engaging lots of people as equals in a thinking aloud and thinking on paper process. So that's at the point, once we identify who our best people are, highly capable and highly connected, then we start sitting down and trying to map out all the different aspects of the problem. So we might be suffering from an antisocial behaviour problem, but not everybody in the district is going to suffer from the same problem in the same way as us. So we need to understand how that's experienced by the different parts of the community and how it fits in with all the other problems they have to deal with. We may be really frantically concerned about antisocial behaviour, but they might be concerned about something entirely different that's not terribly important to us. But if we help them fix their problem, they will help us fix our problem. So the problem analysis stage is step 4. From that problem analysis stage, we will then have time to establish step 5, which allows us to bring together the most engaged and most capable people to form a working group, and therefore move on to step 6 to think about what would the place look like if it was all the problems were fixed, and develop a vision for what the district would look like in the future with all the problems that have been dealt with. Now, we're not going to fix all the problems. We're not that naive, but the idea is to set out a vision for a utopia, for a perfectly good place, and then establish what steps could be implemented to get you to that place. So it helps us to think about what success would look like and making sure that we're clear about that. That leads us on to step 7, which is then establishing, well, what is going to help us achieve that success? What does that look like? And therefore, what steps do we need to get to that point? And also, how do we know that we've achieved that success? Not how have we achieved the intervention, but have we achieved the success? So there's a fair amount of work to be done on thinking about not how many people are involved in our project, but how many people go away having considered the projects to be a success. And then finally, this is a kind of institutional step in step 8. It came from an idea of thinking about what's going to prevent projects happening and being successful, is to establish what we need to do if things start going wrong. How do we escalate the solutions to be dealt with at the appropriate level? So having a plan for things going wrong and having a plan for making sure that people higher up in the hierarchy know exactly what's going on, why it's going on, and calling on them for support. So all of those 8 steps more or less appear one after the other, but we keep going back on each of those steps to refine and revise and develop our understanding as we go. But if we do this in the same way in different places, we're able to allow each different place to be different, but to come up with a similar process so we can treat the members of the public equitably and fairly by giving them and using a consistent and repeatable process. But we can have a different location, we'll have different solutions, different implementation projects, but we're still treating people equally and fairly. So for step 1, the sorts of tools that we need to think about is to establish how important a particular location is. And we've come up with 3 different sets of criteria that we're thinking about. They're not necessarily in an order, but we might think about where a neighbourhood is particularly vulnerable. Um, uh, Certainly, the Jill Dando Institute developed the Vulnerable Localities Index a while back, and there are indices of multiple deprivation that have been used in neighbourhood statistics for very many years. So they help us to understand the wider vulnerability of a district to crime and other disorder or social problems. We also want to make sure that it's actually a crime problem for us, because that's what we're held to account as police forces, are the crime statistics. Not just bulk crime. We need to be careful that we don't just choose areas that have got high volumes of crime. Town centres and retail parks and stuff like that often have very high levels of crime compared to others, but that's what one might expect from a high population or high usage area. So they're not especially important just because they've got high crime, but there might be a harm index, or crime harm might be more considered more important, or that there is a particularly high levels of chronic crime been running for more than 4 years. So we don't really apply intensive engagement for kind of summertime spikes in crime or short-term spikes. We're interested in the crime over a longer period of time. And then the third aspect is that we understand that the sorts of crimes that we're trying to deal with here are public, community-based crimes. Domestic violence, for example, isn't something that community get involved in per se, unless there was a real community-wide or cultural problem with domestic violence. So DV is not something that we would necessarily use for intensive engagement to tackle, but there are plenty of things where there are numbers of different stakeholders or different victims or different perpetrators, and there's a significantly complex for us to be able to tackle it, or that there are crime issues that are not necessarily under the direct influence of policing activity. So just to recap on, I talked about in the last class, the idea of the national decision model. So what we're trying to do here is to impose a LISP, locally identified solutions and practices framework, over the NDM. So what I'm saying here is the NDM isn't completely gone. It's not completely useless in this respect. But what I'm trying to say is that what we need to do is do different things, or be more targeted about what we do under each of those. So in the NDM, it's gathering information, assessing threat and risk, considering of powers and policy, identifying options and contingencies, and then taking action and reviewing. So the plan, do, check, review cycle. So as you can see in the top right hand corner of this slide, the gathering information and intelligence, actually that's the intensive engagement part, that's the start. But what we might do is, rather than assessing threat and risk, we might also look for and assess assets and opportunities, much more like a SWOT analysis than a risk analysis for a threat. We're trying to make sure that we think of these communities as full of assets and full of capabilities and full of skills that we can invest in and help to improve on, which will reduce then the vulnerability to social problems. That's that point where we consider our powers and policy as we think about a problem-rich picture. We try to understand the nature of the problem situation. We're looking for what's known as social capital, which we'll come back to later on, the people who are highly capable and highly connected. And out of them, as we work around to identifying contingencies, then we bring a working group together. So we don't start with a working group, we start with thinking about the skills and assets. And then when we want to think about our options and contingencies, we bring our working group together. We then work with them to create a rich picture of the solution in the context. So not just a bullet point list of options and contingencies, but what those options and contingencies would look like in this particular district, in this neighbourhood. And that allows us to develop a set of shared priorities and collaborative action. It's much more likely that our projects or initiatives, the ideas that we come up with, are going to be successful because we haven't imposed them on people. The working group have designed these from their own experience, rather than us as the specialists and experts coming in and saying, here guys, have a go at this because it worked somewhere else. It's their solutions to their problems. The benefits for this is that we switch our relationship with the neighbourhood away from being a problem into a solution. We're changing the nature of our conversation. We're not asking members of the public what their problems are so that we can go away and fix them. What we're doing is asking them what their solution to the problem might be and helping them implement. We're making sure that we're gathering different perspectives from all different types of citizen, even the people who are participating in the crime itself. Most people in a neighbourhood who are suffering from a crime problem also know or are related to, or might even be those people, or might have been in the past, those people that were part of the problem. Human beings are very complex, and therefore they're going to be baddies and goodies mixed in together. Everyone's going to have a little bit of baddie and goodie in them. So we also help use this process of way of getting the different parts of a neighbourhood to see each other differently as well. So getting them around a table and doing a rich picture analysis helps them as citizens to see other parts of the community more sophisticated, more richly, and to understand each other and be more empathetic to each other. So we can diffuse a lot of community problems just by engaging in this process, getting them to share each other's life world and experience with each other. We're focusing on capabilities and assets, thinking about the positive, appreciative inquiry as one example here, rather than deficit and blame. We will still have to find the problems and we still be realistic about the problems, but we focus on enhancing the assets. And this process, particularly the rich picturing process, allows us and allows the hard to hear residents to speak on their own terms. We're not doing a survey where they have to fit in our preconceived ideas. When we start with a blank paper, they start to communicate to us on their own terms, and therefore we are forced to listen much more carefully, much more closely to what they say. The benefits for you doing this is that it actually demonstrates and legitimates the stuff you already do. This package has been pulled together out of the best of what police officers and PCSOs actually already do. We worked very closely with a whole variety of them to make sure that we are capturing the best. What we've done is made that systematic and repeatable so that everyone can do it and still come up with different answers, but everyone goes through the same process. So each community feels as if they're getting an equal deal. It also creates an evidence space for you to influence people's behaviour. Sometimes senior officers, but also members of the community, telling them and explaining to them why you should be doing something requires you to have evidence. Evidence-based policing isn't always on the basis of going to journals and trials and finding out what's been done somewhere else. You need to develop the evidence that works in this particular community at this particular time and know why you're going to act in this particular location. So it gives you a clear basis of action in partnership with other statutory agencies, making sure that you're able to hold them to account and making sure you're escalating. The process also doesn't require a kind of seed funding approach, doesn't expect that there is new resource. It assumes that there is no resource, but allows you to start looking for resource that already exists. So if you start looking for assets already available in a community, you're bringing those assets to bear on your problem, you don't need new resource per se. And it's a process that can be done on the fly. We've tried to make sure that the bureaucracy is as minimal as we possibly can, but a way in which you can do these activities on the street corner, in a reassurance visit, at a surgery, wherever and whenever, in and part of your day-to-day duties. It's not something new or separate over and above your day duties, but comes out of your day duties that stitch all the things that you normally do, add a few additional things to it, making them more focused and more sharp, but then captured in an institutional memory in a document that allows other people to see what you have been doing, what you're thinking, and what you're heading towards.